So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our evening with Wendy Holden, who will be telling us all about her latest book, The Governess. It's all very exciting. On a housekeeping note, if you'd like to ask questions later on, would you be good enough to put them in through the Q&A or the chat button at the bottom of your screen? So this evening, we're so lucky to have Roya Nicker, who's going to be interviewing Wendy. Roya is the royal correspondent for the Sunday Times newspaper. She has a decade of experience in royal coverage, breaking exclusive stories and covering major royal events, and has secured exclusive interviews with members of the royal family, including the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Sussex. She also travels extensively on overseas royal tours. That's pre-COVID, obviously. Roya also works with several national and international broadcasters and has presented 2 royal documentaries, Prince William, Monarch in the Making, and Meghan and Harry, The Baby Years. Last year, she took part in the BBC's coverage of the Queen's birthday parade, Trooping the Colour, and the D-Day commemorations. In 2018, she was involved in the BBC's official coverage of the wedding of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. So without further ado, please can I welcome Roya, who's going to introduce Wendy Holden, our guest speaker. Thank you very much.
Well, Cheryl, thank you very much. Wendy, I think, needs no introduction, acclaimed, prolific author. And actually, I only just recently learned former deputy editor of the Sunday Times. So
Yes.
I feel like I'm in very good company, and as we once worked at the same place.
Yes.
I wanted to start by asking you about your new book, The Governess, which is wonderful and intriguing for a royal correspondent like me to read. But it's fair to say, I think, Wendy, that it's a real departure from your usual writing and the sort of places you normally go with your fiction. So can you start a little bit by telling us about how you came across the story of Marion Crawford, and then why you decided to write a whole book about her?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Roy. It's so exciting to speak to you. Actually, I love your pieces. I've got lots of inspiration and interest from them. So it's a real thrill to be able to speak to you about these things. Yes, of course. I had 20 years as a comic novelist, and it was obviously a big change to go into historical fiction. But I think I'd always wanted to do it. And it goes back an awfully long way. I mean, when I was a child, my grandmother had a souvenir of the coronation of George VI. And it was completely fascinating for a small child because it was full of people in crowns, people in furs, of people in carriages, absolutely amazing. But what I could see, even at that early age, was that they were all very distinct characters, that the Windsors were really big personalities, and what was more, they were all very different from each other. So, George V and Queen Mary were very different from Edward VIII. I mean, he was very glamorous, very languorous, very gorgeous. They were very stuffy, very Victorian. So there were so many interesting contrasts within the family. So I think even at that age, I realised there was something about them that was novelistic, that was, big and dramatic, and so I think I stored that up. And for a long time I wrote comic novels, and I was very happy doing that, and I was very successful at it, and it was all great. But I always had this idea in the back of my mind, and particularly as time passed, I felt that it was really strange that no one had ever written a novel about the Windsors, because there were obviously hundreds of novels about the Tudors, but nothing about the Windsors. And particularly when The Crown came out, it seemed absolutely mad that there was not a work of fiction. So I started to think about it seriously, but I couldn't find the way in. I couldn't find the right approach because it's difficult. I didn't want it to be a butler. I didn't want it to be a maid. I wanted it to be something that was sort of on the same level and a bit unusual. So fast forward to a bookshop in Northumberland, rainy half-term day. It literally fell out of the shelf, this book called The Little Princesses by Marion Crawford. And I vaguely had heard of her, but I didn't really know her story. So I started to read it, and I could see immediately on the first page that this was a story I'd been looking for, because within 2 paragraphs, she'd said the magic words, "I never wanted to work for the royal family. I wanted to work in the slums. I wanted to help the children there. I desperately wanted to do something." So that was it. That was the story. How on earth did a woman with those ambitions end up right at the other end of the social scale, and that's really where the whole story began for me. So that was it. That was the red button pressed.
And you write it's obviously a fictionalized account of her 17 years with the royal family, with the young princesses. Instead of writing a biography, you brought fiction to it, and I was very interested to know, how do you go about bringing to life and imagining events and conversations behind palace walls between members of the royal family? How do you try and make that sound sort of authentic, and how do you bring those imagined events to life?
Well, like any work of historical fiction, whether it's film, whether it's telly, whether it's The Crown, whether it's The Governess, whatever it is, it's the same principle. You take the known facts and you fill it in with your imagination, but it's not just that. I mean, in the case of The Governess, I read Marion Crawford's autobiography, The Little Princesses. Obviously, that was my sort of main text. But she also wrote a couple of other books, one about Queen Mary, one about the Queen, that were quite hagiographical, but they had little sort of anecdotes in that were illuminating. But more than that, or around that, I read every biography, every history, everything around the period, newspapers, all kinds of little bits and pieces that I found on market stalls about the royal family that would fill in this picture, because there isn't a lot about Marion Crawford because of her erasure from history, which I suppose we'll get to eventually. There's not much about her personal life, which was a bit I really had to imagine. But I imagined it given the context of her as a student at a time of huge social and political change, in a context where there would have been lots of ideas and lots of people that she would have met in Edinburgh. So that wasn't difficult to imagine that for her. And as for the royal family, there's so many, as you know yourself, there are so many fascinating biographies which go into great detail about the procedural life at Buckingham Palace throughout. It doesn't actually change a lot, it seems to me, from the 30s to the present day, how things are done. Maybe the footmen's uniforms are a bit different, but it's pretty much the same thing. So it wasn't difficult to put it together, but I always had to keep in mind the fact that this was a young woman. This is a young woman from a completely different background and with a completely different set of values from the place that she was going. So that was the most important thing to keep in mind. How would this world have appeared to someone like that, someone who was a young woman who got a vote for the first time, who was a professional woman, for the first time. So she was a sort of very modern figure going to a very old-fashioned place. That was the main thing to keep in mind.
I was very interested in what you just said there about her journey, how she goes from, because we the reader meet her, we first encounter her as a trainee teacher in Edinburgh, and then of course we see her very quickly going to, although with a little bit of in a struggle, going to work for the royal family, and we meet her with very strong moral principles and a sense of ethics about her mission, which is to help sort of very disadvantaged people, those on the most sort of margins of society. She wants to educate them, and then of course she ends up, we soon see her moving, within the confines of palace walls, being governess to a future queen. So how did she justify that to herself, or do you think she sort of perhaps felt that the rarefied royal family needed her help as much as the poor and disadvantaged? Was that a sort of fictionalized thing, or do you think that's really what she felt?
I think it's quite likely it's what she felt, but the way I came to that conclusion was, there were so many different elements to it. So to sort of unpack it, the reasons that she didn't want to go to join the royal family at all, it wasn't something she'd ever intended to do, and she only really did it because she was working for the Queen Mother's sister. She was a Duchess of York at the time, and the Queen Mother came up to see her sister, and she saw this kind of very lively young woman running around the lawns with her niece, and thought, that's the girl I want for my daughters. So she kind of basically made her come down for a month on a trial period, and Marion Crawford didn't really want to do it, but she went anyway, but she thought it would only last a month. And she justified it to herself, I think, and this is what I put in the book, that, she couldn't, for the moment, help the poor of the slums. But on the other hand, rich people wealthy people, powerful people needed education as well, particularly at that time, because, you know, people were fairly unaware of the sort of things that she was aware of. For example, how difficult it was to teach very poor children. It was very difficult for them to learn anything. She knew lots of things that we see as standard now, but were quite new then. Anyway, so I think she said to herself, okay, I'll go down there and see what I can do to, you know, educate the rulers. But the thing that really made the difference, and made all the difference, and is a central relationship of the governess, is Crawford and Princess Elizabeth. Because she thought this child, and she says this in The Little Princesses, and this was such a great thing for me to fictionalize in The Governess, was, you know, she thought she was going to be a spoilt brat. She thought she was going to be really difficult. She wasn't going to like her. She was going to be ghastly. And when she got down there to Royal Lodge after this day-long train journey from Edinburgh, she was exhausted. And to find that the princess was waiting up for her was kind of a nightmare. So she sort of stomped up to the royal nurseries thinking this is going to be dreadful, and found this child, this enchanting child, sitting up in bed with her little golden curls in her perfectly ordinary nightdress, pretending to drive her horses around the park because she tied dressing gown cords to the corners of the bed, and she was pretending that this is a horse. And Marion Crawford, she just completely fell in love with her on the spot, and it was mutual. So it was this very strong relationship between this very odd couple, this sort of woke student, and this young princess, and they couldn't have been more different. But that was it, you know, and that was a relationship that remained for 17 years, really close and really successful.
You mentioned there, you used the word ordinary, but there's not that much ordinary about the young Elizabeth that we first meet, because when we first meet her, she is a very rare creature. She's, you know, ensconced in lace and frills and satin slippers. And we then have, what's really lovely is you see Crawford trying to do some normal things with her. So she takes her on the tube. She wants to try and take her swimming to public swimming pools. And she is with Elizabeth for a very, very formative time in her life. I mean, she's with her through an abdication, a coronation, the Second World War, you know, her marriage to Prince Philip. We have that very famous image of a young Princess Elizabeth, but a sort of growing woman during the Second World War, when it's an image where she's very much sort of seen through one of the people. She's in the auxiliary territorial service, and she's driving trucks, and, you know, we find out through the sort of PR palace propaganda there that she's able to, you know, change tires. And I just wonder, with all those sort of normal experiences that Crawford tries to give her from a very young age, I suppose through until the day she leaves, how important do you think Marion Crawford was in bringing the young Princess Elizabeth closer to her subjects?
I think she was very important. I think she was completely central and completely crucial. And it's such an interesting point you make, because going back to one of the reasons I was interested in doing this book, it's the Queen is such a mysterious figure. I mean, she's the most successful public figure in the country. She's the most successful monarch in the world, and she very rarely puts a foot wrong. And so one of my approaches to the book was who influenced her. You know, what's at the heart of this woman? What did she learn when she was a child? So the whole idea of Crawford coming down from Edinburgh with all her ideas about social justice, and deciding that this young princess was much too removed from the real world, and she was in her frills, and she couldn't play in the garden even. She didn't even know any games. So it was a real kind of, you know, she had to teach her everything, you know, how to catch a ball even. So, but I think it was really, really important that she took her out into the real world, to go on the tube, to swim in public swimming pools, as you say, and the guide pack that she set up, all of which were designed to bring the princess closer to how normal people lived. And I think the enduring legacy of that, and this is what has always raised the Queen above the rest of her family, is that she's always seen as somebody even though she spent 94 years, in the most cosseted world imaginable, she is seen as somebody that people can relate to and that understands people on a very sort of ordinary level. People have, dreams about her coming to tea and all that sort of thing. And I think that's Crawford's enduring legacy. And it's a kind of an amazing trick, but people really do think that the Queen switches off the lights and uses sort of plastic tubs for her breakfast cereal. And she's seen as this incredibly approachable figure, which is the secret of her success and her longevity as a monarch. So I think all that you can trace directly back to Marion Crawford, and the fact that the most successful public figure in the world and in our country was basically influenced so fundamentally and successfully by a woman no one's ever heard of. It was that another central contrast to the story that really drew me.
I mean, it's so interesting listening to that, and I mean, as a royal correspondent, I've read a fair few royal biographies, and I feel, compared to someone who's not in the bubble like I am, that I feel I'm relatively well informed about historical sort of the Queen's life. But I found myself reading The Governess, and there's so many wonderful details that I'm longing to know. Oh, is that fiction? Is that based in fact? And there's one that really struck me, and it actually comes up quite a few times in Elizabeth's early years when Marion starts, which is this very, very precise way of going about things. She describes, we hear Marion sort of describe how Princess Elizabeth cuts her food up very precisely, how she lines her pencils up very precisely.
Yeah.
Which when you read it, and I think, and I've read some of the pieces you've written around the book recently, it sounds almost like obsessive compulsive disorder, the young Queen perhaps suffered from OCD. And I wanted to ask, is that based in fact? Is that something that Marion touched on in her book? Do we know?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. She does touch on that, and it's completely fascinating because it opens up so it's a real light into the life of into the Queen's childhood. Because I mean, the thing about The Governess isn't, it's obviously fascinating about the fact that she came from this background and went to that place. But the other thing about it that is brilliant as far as being a historical novel is concerned is, as you say, it's the 17 most seismic years of the 20th century. And she joined just before the abdication. She was with them through the coronation of their parents, completely unexpected coronation, and the whole of the Second World War. And that was fascinating. But what's brilliant for me is the fact that she was not just seeing it on the same level as the Windsors generally, which she was. She was seeing it from the particular point of view of these two little girls, and Princess Elizabeth in particular, because she was obviously particularly fond of her. And so the fact that Crawford was their constant companion and their friend and their confidant, and she was there when their parents weren't, she was always there, meant that she saw how these events affected them, and things that seem fascinating and historical and glamorous to us. When you're two little girls and right at the centre of this, you don't necessarily understand what's going on. And as you say, one of the ways that Lilibet, as they obviously called her, expressed her confusion was by this very over-organised behaviour, which became progressively more extreme. And so yes, in the first time Marion comes across it, it's at the lunch table and she's cutting up her food, and she's particularly setting out her pieces of sugar from the sugar bowl in a very orderly row, whereas Margaret was just sort of shoving it in. And then it becomes more extreme, and then there is this scene where Lilibet is putting her shoes just so before she goes to bed, putting the laces ruler straight, arranging her clothes absolutely perfectly, and not just that, getting out of bed during the night to make sure that they're still where they should be, which sort of gives you an insight into the amount of sort of worry she must have been carrying, how bewildering it must have been. And the fact that, and it was a great scene to fictionalize, because I have in The Governess, I have Crawford waking up thinking, what's all this noise, what's going on? And she goes next door and Lilibet's there fussing with her shoes, but it's a frightened little girl. And so it gives you this rare view of the Queen, who we see as this very controlled person who you can barely, with a complete game face most of the time, as a frightened child. And it's very endearing and interesting and revealing and humanizing. So I think they're important scenes, and I felt they really added to the drama, the what it was really like.
It's interesting hearing you talk about humanizing the Queen, because like for so many people, the Queen is just she is this sort of figure that has such mystique, whether it's from the image that we're very familiar with on a banknote or a coin or a stamp, but a lot of people who don't maybe work alongside her or see her sometimes on engagements like I do, just have her as a sort of an image. And to what extent do you think that a book like this can bring the humanity sort of to the Queen a bit? How important is that? Do you think that we see her more in the round?
Well, I think it was a great opportunity to be able to look into her childhood, because obviously her childhood is what's made her. The child makes a man, etc. And so, yes, I think it reveals a lot about her. And one of the things that's really interesting is the story in general. I'm thinking about Marion Crawford's book, The Little Princesses, and what it revealed about the royal family, how they were so close. The Windsors, as they were then, the King George VI and Queen Elizabeth and Princess Margaret and Princess Elizabeth, they were such a solid unit and so close. And it's such an interesting contrast to the way the royal family is seen now. I mean, a completely sort of mutually supportive network in which the idea of anybody being jealous of anybody else. Although, having said that, I'm already correcting myself and saying, well, actually, it wasn't all sunshine, because Princess Margaret, who was a fantastic character to write in this book, was completely different from her sister. And even though they were very, very close, they were different. They were completely different children. And Lilibet was very dutiful, very eager to please, very willing. And Margaret was completely different, very naughty, always playing tricks on people, very funny, very clever. So, within the we four setup, there were sort of slight schisms, but generally it was a very close unit. And I think that's an interesting thing to see now in the context of the royal families as they seem today. And it's very endearing and lovely how close the Queen was to her parents and how crucial they were.
Was there anyone, as you researched the sort of main characters and principles, were there any members of the royal family who surprised you, whose perception of them changed as you sort of researched and explored them further?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the Queen Mother, she was one of the most interesting characters. She's quite a confusing figure in the sense that her title changes all the time. So at the beginning of the story, she's a Duchess of York, and then she becomes Queen Elizabeth, and then obviously in life, not necessarily in the governess, because it doesn't go that far. She's a Queen Mother. But I was fascinated by her because she seemed to me at the beginning of the story, and in the way I've written her in the governess, is that this quite sort of entitled, quite sort of self-indulgent person who just had a lot of fun, who was an aristocrat with lots of glamorous friends, who had a wonderful time, just had fun really, and then unexpectedly found herself, after the convulsion of the abdication, found herself the Queen. And it wasn't something that went very well to start with, because they weren't seen as brilliant successors to the fabulously glamorous Edward VIII, whose departure had been such a shock and also such a blow for the monarchy. So they didn't get off to a flying start. And so there was a bit of a problem there to start with. And then along came the war, and this woman who'd been this slightly lightweight sort of Woodhouseian figure found her role. She became, with her husband, these great figures who rallied a nation in their darkest hour. And it was absolutely brilliant to be able to write those scenes, that change, that journey from one person to another, and have her in scenes with people like Eisenhower, people like Joseph Kennedy, fighting for Britain during the war, trying to get the Americans on side, and doing it with tea and cakes and lots of sort of clever talk. It was sort of brilliant diplomacy. So that was really fun to sort of step up her game and follow her particular trajectory. She was my favourite character to do with that, yeah.
The Little Princesses, which is such a very important part of the book and of Crawford's story, and ultimately how she ends up, that was published in 1950, but when it was published, it was an entirely wholesome, very glowing account of her time with them, of the young princesses' lives. How did it come to be written? How did she come to write it?
It's such a confusing story and such a long story, but the basic facts are, interestingly, given that Crawfey was basically ostracized as a result of writing it and cast into the outer darkness by the royal family, it did begin as the Queen Mother's initiative, as Queen Elizabeth, as she was then, wife of George VI. There's so many Elizabeths in the stories, it is a bit confusing. So it was the initiative of Queen Elizabeth. This was to do with the war, to do with strengthening the post-war relationship with America. She thought it would be a great idea for articles about Princess Elizabeth, her daughter, the heir to the throne, to appear in the American press. And so she got this courtier to write them, and he went to Crawfey and asked Crawfey for the information, because he didn't really know much about Princess Elizabeth. Crawfey by then had left. She'd married this very sort of slightly manipulative man. He could see that there was money. He had pound signs in his eyes. He could see there was money here. He said to her, "Why don't you do it yourself?" Anyway, so there were three elements to it. There was Crawfey's husband, and there were two American journalists who worked for the magazine, who edited the magazine the articles were going to appear in. They basically worked on her. They told her that whatever she wrote, that she should write it herself, and whatever she wrote, the Queen Mother would see, the Queen would see it, it would all be fine. But basically that wasn't true. So she wrote her book, which appeared originally as articles. The Queen didn't give permission, but it was published anyway. And even though, as you say, it was harmless, it was admiring, it was loving, it was respectful, the royal family was so incensed, including princesses, that they just cast her into the outer darkness, and they never spoke to her again. And it is an amazing situation, in as much as it went on for so long. I mean, this, as you say, was 1950, The Little Princesses was published. And she died in 1988. And in all that time, there had literally been nothing. There had been no forgiveness. There had been not a single card, nothing. She wasn't invited to the coronation, to anything. And I went, as part of my research, I went to Aberdeen, where Crawfey went to live after this had all happened. And she bought a house that was right by the side of the road to Balmoral, which I think must have meant that she was hoping one day, as the royal cavalcades of shining cars went past, that one day they would stop and they'd say, "Oh, you know, let's it's fine, let's forget it, and come in for tea." But they never did. And when she died, they didn't send any flowers. It's the most awful, sad end. And there's this one more thing, Moira, that I have to tell you, which is that it was one of the reasons she was ostracized, was that it was considered she was sort of profiteering from her royal connections, and she was shamelessly making money from the relationship she'd had with them. But all the time she was ostracized, all the time she was exiled, she kept this little chest. It was a little wooden chest that she'd had made herself, little sort of pirate chest with a kind of round sort of shape lid, and inside it she kept all the letters that the princesses had ever sent her, all tied up with ribbon, all the notes the Queen Mother had sent her, loads of personal information. And any time she could have sold it, it could have, gone to auction anywhere, but she never did. She kept it all her life. And when she died, she left it to the Queen, and it went into the Royal Archives, never to be seen again. But so, I think, but interestingly, when the Queen was 94 earlier this year, and there was a little bits of footage released to coincide with the birthday. There was a little tiny film that appeared, which had Crawfey dancing the Lambeth Walk with the princesses, and it seemed to me that might be a sign that the tanker was turning around, that the Queen, was prepared to, reassess this terrible injustice, miscarriage of justice, or however you want to say it. It's really sad end to a happy story.
Why do you think that this was a woman who had seen them through seismic events, not just the young princess, but had been there for the king and the queen as well. Why do you think that the banishment and the punishment was so extreme, because it was very extreme.
It was really extreme, and yes, she absolutely had given up her life for them, and she'd given up any chance of her own children when she finally retired. It was too late, and she made this bad marriage. She gave up her personal life for 17 years, 17 really important years, because they were the kind of childbearing years, I suppose. But anyway, yes, I think it was about an example. I think at that stage, if you worked for the royal family, you were supposed to be, as they put it, utterly oyster. You were supposed to be completely discreet and never say a single word. And I think it was the ostracism of Crawford and the brutal treatment of her was really to make sure that nobody would ever do the same thing again, and nobody would ever write a book about the royal family again, which obviously went really well.
Well, I mean, that clearly didn't work. I mean, notwithstanding members of the royal family themselves who contributed to books, the Prince of Wales through the Dimbleby book, and Diana through the Andrew Morton book. We've had, in the last 20 years, press secretaries, private secretaries. It really didn't work, did it?
It really didn't work. And I think it must have been very bewildering for her because one of the, as you say, one of the major invaders of royal privacy has been the royals themselves. And this started with the Queen. In 1969, there was the celebrated royal family TV documentary.
You can't watch anymore. You cannot
can't watch anymore. Exactly. But I mean, obviously, everybody watched it at the time. And Crawford probably did too. And she probably thought, well, hang on a minute. What did I do that was so bad? Here they are having, people practically following them into the loo, and I never, I was just lovely about them. So I think it was to discourage other people, to make an example of her. Absolutely, I think that was the main thing. And as I said, it didn't work.
Did you get a sense beyond, in your research, did you get a sense beyond that little clip that we saw actually earlier this year of her with the young princesses, that the Queen has any sort of personal regret about the way that the royal family behaved and what happened?
Well, I've only really got that to go on because obviously I don't have access to the Queen and what she thinks about things, but I can't believe it. I mean, having spent so much time inside the head of the Queen as a child, and having written about the very strong relationship that she had with Marion Crawford and what a crucial influence she was on her, I can't believe that it meant nothing, And I think as you get older, whoever you are, those things become more important and things sort of crystallize and they sort of become simpler in a way. And I can't believe that she never thinks about her and that she never, and when she's at Balmoral or wherever because she doesn't really go anywhere apart from the places she's always gone. So these places must be full of memories. And she must think about her. So I'm sure it must be a source of regret. It's so sad because they had, I mean, I'm slightly making it sound so tragic, and it was tragic, but actually there was so much that was so fun, and this is what was so great about writing the story. The middle section of the story, which is the abdication, the coronation, the life at Buckingham Palace. There was a lot of fun. They even had fun during the war. I mean, it was Crawford that put on the pantomimes, the famous pantomimes.
Yeah, such famous images.
Yeah, exactly. So that with the Queen in her sort of breeches and Princess Margaret as Cinderella. I mean, they had a good time. She was fun. She tried to make their lives fun. She tried to bring fun into these very distant and formal existences, these Victorian royal existences that the princesses had been living before she arrived. So absolutely, she was a huge influence. And I think since then, I mean, Crawford obviously was the last governess, but I think she paved the way for a more normal approach to education for the royal family in general from then on. I mean, there are obviously nannies about, but they basically go to school now. They basically have a more of a normal life, which started there. I mean, she was the bridge between the Victorian past and where we are now. So a really important figure in so many ways, but no one had ever heard of her. And one of the reasons for that was the ostracism, because official histories of the time, biographies of the time, whatever, they don't mention Crawford apart from to say, she was a silly woman, she wrote this silly book and she got what was coming to her, which is obviously completely unjust. but that was the orthodoxy. And what attracted me about the story was the fact that I thought there was more to it. It couldn't have been just that. And reading her own story, her own version of events, it was completely different. She wasn't a silly woman who wrote a silly book. She was a crucial figure.
So do you hope that the governess will slightly go away to rehabilitating her legacy in a way?
Yeah, I hope so. I think she should. I think she should come out of the shadows and be seen for what she was. Because there aren't many people, as you know yourself, there aren't many people that come out of the royal bubble and can see, having experienced it at such a level and so intimately. She lived she went to Windsor, she went to Sandringham, she went to Balmoral, she lived there in the same way as they did, and it's completely fascinating because there are hardly any accounts. I don't think there are any other accounts apart from hers. So it was that intimacy, it was that behind the curtain, it was the behind the scenes aspect that was completely irresistible. So it's not just her role as an educator or her role as a modernizer, it's her reportage, it's her, this is what it's like. And I bet it's still like that. I can't believe it's that much different. I bet there is in Balmoral. I have a scene in The Governess, which I came across the story in a couple of books, but it was just too irresistible. The idea that there is, in a drawing room at Balmoral, there is a chair, which was Queen Victoria's own chair, and you're not allowed to sit on it. No one's allowed to sit on it. And if you sit on it, you've made the worst solecism anyone possibly could. So of course Crawford almost sits on it, and and people that they want to play tricks on always sit on it afterwards. But it's just so brilliant because there really is a chair where you're not allowed to sit.
I'm surprised that chair didn't turn up in Tony Blair or Cherie Blair's memoirs, because they wrote so much about their trips to Balmoral.
I know. I can't believe they missed that.
Marion Crawford in your book is when we meet her and throughout her time, she comes to the royal household a modern professional career woman with ambition, with quite radical liberal views towards society, and she wants to shake things up, and ultimately she ends up ruffling feathers and outside the royal household, which sounds quite familiar. Sounds a bit like
that reminds us of
describing contemporary events.
Yeah.
And you've drawn some interesting parallels recently in some articles I've read that you've written between Crawford and the Duchess of Sussex. Just tell me a little bit more about your sort of thoughts there, and perhaps what both their experiences, or Meghan's experience so far, what that perhaps you think tells us about outsiders coming in to that age-old institution.
Yeah, I think outsiders coming in is one thing. Outsiders with sort of woke ideas coming in might be something a bit different. And I think it's amazing, the similarities. As you say, they are both professional women, and Crawford, even more than Meghan Markle, was a really modern figure for the early 1930s. This was a woman from the first generation of women who could vote, who could train for a career, who could be educated, on a large scale. She was a really and determined to grab all that and make something of it. So she was a really modern figure. So there is that in common, and of course having completely different ideas and wanting to shake things up, as you say. But there's even the parallels that go even further than that, because they even lived in the same house, which is so amazing. Because when Crawford was first married to the lovely George, her conniving husband, the kind of money obsessed husband, they lived at Nottingham Cottage. They lived in the same house. It's so amazing. It's like there's something in the walls there. She lived there, and it was so stunning. It was a Grace and Favour house. It was lovely. It would have been the perfect place, but after the ructions following the little princesses, they had to leave. But yeah, they lived in the same house as well as all the other, and of course they're both associated with notorious books. So there's about at least 4 or 5. But I think the serious point to make about it is, Meghan Markle obviously ran into trouble trying to shake things up when she was within the royal family. This Crawford's efforts to modernise went down really well and were really successful. It was only after she left that they became a problem, because they were expecting her book, which they didn't like, not because of the modernising. It was more because of the privacy and the revelations about what they saw as their kind of intimate private lives. But I think, generally speaking, it's always complicated and potentially quite dangerous for anyone to come into the royal fold with ideas about modernising, because it kind of goes wrong either on the spot or afterwards. It seems to be an institution that has to want to modernise itself rather than have anyone else coming. But it's interesting that they're both women, and in a way, even though Meghan Markle is seen as this kind of crusading woke figure, she's actually less so than Marion Crawford was, because Marion Crawford is a woman from the 1930s, where to have any kind of a career and any kind of ideas from her background about social justice on that scale was really revolutionary. So she really was, I would say, even more of a disruptor than Meghan, and though obviously not quite so well known.
And what happened to Crawford after she left Royal Service? I mean, you mentioned she wrote a couple of other books, but did she go on and have other careers or
No, not really. She basically went to Aberdeen and sort of hung her head in shame. I mean, I think she was really absolutely devastated by what had happened, and spent the rest of her life hoping for this reconciliation, hence the house by the side of the road. You know, I think it was, and there were a couple of suicide attempts, and it's really sad. It really did end, and you could not have seen that coming. I mean, that's the one of the aspects of her story that's so dramatic and such a wonderful thing to fictionalize. The beginning, the middle, and the end, they're all so dramatic. You know, the woke student, the royal life, and then this end, which is so sad. So yeah, it's like 3 acts really.
You mentioned earlier that you spent so much time getting inside the head of the Queen. Do you feel now you have a greater sympathy, empathy with her, a greater understanding of perhaps some of the things she's done in her life and the sort of situation she's responded to, because you have a greater understanding of her very formative years? Do you feel you understand the Queen better now?
Well, I can understand the context of where she came from better, and I can understand the influence on her, the Crawford's influence, and the various experiences that she had with her, and how this influenced her life. But the impression I get of the Queen generally is, and I think this is the thing that we all see, is her amazing self-control. I mean, there was an anecdote early in Marion Crawford's memoirs, which I almost put in, but I could never quite make it work without it sounding really sort of cheesy. But she writes about when she was in a chapel with the Queen. I think it was a chapel at Royal Lodge next to the house. And it was a really hot day, and there was this bee sort of buzzing around the preacher. And Crawford says, "Oh, well, no, we were watching this bee, and this bloke was bald, and absolutely sure it was going to land on his head." And she was sort of standing there in the pew, looking at this bee. Was it going to land on this bloke's bald head? And it did. And all the servants laughed like drains. But looking along the pew to the royal family, and first next to her was Princess Elizabeth, they were all absolutely expressionless, even the little girls. So even at that age, this would have been about 6, she had that iron self-discipline, which I think is the, Crawford tried her best to liven her up and draw her out of it. But I think essentially that very disciplined person is still the person that we see with the self-control, which is completely fascinating, because of course most of us aren't like that. We couldn't possibly do that. And so it's this, the idea of the Queen being some kind of super being who's got these incredible powers of restraint and self-restraint.
She really does.
Exactly. We step back to so long ago.
I think that's the secret to her success, is that no one really knows what she thinks, except her very close friends who are very discreet. So having spent all this time delving into the world of the Windsors for the first time, will there be anyone else that you'll be writing about?
Oh, absolutely.
The royal bug?
Completely, I'm totally obsessed now. I wish I had your job, Laura. When if we could swap, we could do a job swap. I am absolutely wild about them now. I can't get enough. And so the next, and one of the things I found, which has been the most fun about writing The Governess, is taking these figures who are we just see as sort of royal sort of monoliths, people like Queen Mary, and particularly people like Wallace Simpson, who I found I really sympathised with, and I found I was really interested in her. I thought she must be a really sort of funny, lively person, and there was a real story there. And so I made her quite a big character in The Governess, and I wanted to carry that on and look into her. So she is my next subject, because she's very similar in the sense, obviously she's American and came from a different country and all the rest of it, but in the sense that she came into the royal family and completely shook them up, because she was also a modernizer. I mean, I think she saw herself as someone who could help Edward VIII be a better king, because she was, not quite so stuffy as the people around her. She wasn't such a sycophant. She had ideas about how he could help the working man, which he was completely obsessed with. I mean, as you probably know, he had a kind of fantasy about himself, being a friend of the miners and all this, and he took it really seriously. And I think she thought that was a good thing, and she wanted to help him. It was part of her not really sort of seeing how things really were. So I think she was a good-hearted person. He saw that he, wanted to do good things, only it was not ever going to work. So I feel there's a lot, and it's an unintentional comedy too. It's very funny. I mean, even in The Governess, I find that there's lots about it that's so funny, because these worlds are so glamorous and so rarefied, but they're also quite funny because there's so much that goes wrong and so much that's kind of, really quite sort of basic about them. Like the fact that, they're at Balmoral and they're just striding around in the heather with all the midges all the time. And it's just really not very glamorous at all, or slithering about on their bellies with a gun. It's just very uncomfortable, this sort of high life. And it's so funny. So I'm drawn to all that, the contrast, the behind the scenes, all that.
Wendy on Wallace, that's definitely one thing to watch out for.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wendy, I could chat to you all night, but I feel that we should give a few other people a chance to ask you a few questions too. So it's been lovely to talk to you.
And you, Roy, thank you for such brilliant questions.
So enjoyed it. It's a very, very fascinating book.
Thank you.
But I will, for now, hand back to Cheryl to open questions to the floor.
Okay, thank you, Roy, and thank you, Wendy. I'm hooked.
Pleasure.
Totally, can't wait. One little thing that occurred to me is, what happened to Crawford's husband? Who outlived who? What sort of happened? Oh,
he died in 1977. So she outlived him. So yeah, it was after that it became particularly. I think she was particularly lonely after that. Even though I don't think the marriage was very successful, she really was on her own after he died. So yeah, that was him. That was George.
Such a shame. And was she sort of unhappy with him? And did she see that he was actually quite money grabbing? And
no, I don't think she was. I don't think she was happy with him. I don't think. I mean, I think she'd married late and in a hurry. I mean, in The Governess, I've made, in the first part of the book, I made up various affairs for her, and various relationships that can't work, that don't really work. And one of the reasons they don't work is that it's, as people have found out many times since, it's impossible to be in the royal bubble and to have a life. You can't have a private life and work for the Windsors. It's not really possible, particularly when you're that intimately involved with their everyday lives. You have to be inside or outside, and Corfie had to make the decision to be inside. And that's one of the struggles that she has with her situation in The Governess. But when she left the royal family, that's when she married George Boothleigh, he was called. He was a bank manager.
So did she leave to marry him? How had she met him? She presumably hadn't met him while she was still working for the royal family, or had she managed to meet him?
It's not the actual facts of it. I've sort of skated over, because I was more interested in her what happened. The end of the story is so sad that I didn't want that to be the main thrust of the novel. So yeah, I mean, she met him at some stage. She probably met him in Scotland, and they were together for a long time, but I don't think it was happy. And I think he did see possibly that she was potentially a cash cow, and she was quite naive, she was quite innocent. She'd spent all this time having this quite rarefied royal existence, not much exposure to the outside world, so she was quite vulnerable, really. And I think it's possible that he saw that. So yeah, it was sad.
has anything been mooted about a film or television for this book? It sounds as if...
Oh, wouldn't that be good? I don't know. I mean, I think there are various things going on, but I'm not really sure that's what the agents are doing. So
Yeah. Oh, so watch this space. It sounds...
Yes, exactly. I hope so.
Yeah, it sounds as if it would make be very filmic anyway. Sounds great.
It would be brilliant. It'd be wonderful. Yeah, exactly. It would be the Edward and Mrs. Simpson of 2020, or maybe 2021, which I've been working my way through at the moment. Actually, Edward and Mrs. Simpson with Edward Fox. Great, it's absolutely great fun.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So you think this is the way forward now for this historical fiction? Sounds.
Yes, I think so. I love writing historical fiction. It's really fun. Yeah, absolutely. So that's definitely the way forward for me. So yes, exactly. There'll be many more coming, I hope.
Oh, good. Roy, have you anything else to add?
I think, what would you consider bringing? There's so much debate at the moment with you constantly see like the makers of The Crown saying they're going to stop after 5 series and they're going to do 6 and then they're going to do 5 and then they do 6, and there's a big debate about how close to modern present day they bring it. Peter Morgan brings it. Are you intrigued at all by maybe after Wallace writing something either biography or fictionalized around the current Windsors that we're seeing now, because we are not short of storylines at the moment?
No, it's not short of storylines. No, absolutely. Well, I mean, the thing is that what I like to say about the Governess is that it's actually the prequel to The Crown. I mean, this starts in 1932 and ends in pretty much ends when the Queen gets married, which is where The Crown begins. So, you know, it's the bit in between Victoria and the start of The Crown. So I think I'm sort of, you know, that's my slot. I think the modern royals, I'm not quite so intrigued with the very up to the minute ones, because they're less mysterious, because more is known about them. I mean, they are mysterious in the sense that they are royals and we don't really know what goes on. Although you do, Roy, obviously most of us don't. But I'm more interested in the past, and it's just more the contrasts, the social contrasts are bigger somehow. Although even as I say that, I can see that there are so many parallels between the 1930s and where we are now. But I'm drawn to the past, and particularly with the Wallace book, the crazy world of the 1920s and 30s, the sort of hedonism of it, the sort of the way that people just lived life in a crazy freewheeling way with never ever any sort of idea about the future or what's going to happen. And the sort of big, I'm talking about high society really, the sort of big personalities, these huge sort of amazing camp people having these unbelievable parties. It's completely excessive and extreme, and a bit like the 1980s in a way. So I'm interested in that period.
Will that Wallace book, will that be fiction, or will it be, it'll
be the same kind of thing. It'll be fictionography. But you see, with her, what I was interested in, and it's kind of similar to the Crawford story, in as much as, you know, Wallace Simpson came to London in 1928, and she was middle-aged. She wasn't very good looking. She had no money. She didn't know anybody. She was married to Ernest, who was a bit like a kind of Charles Pooter out of Diary of a Nobody. You know, he was really into kind of silver hallmarks and, you know, reading ancient Greek aloud. You know, he was quite sort of, he wasn't anyone's idea of a good time man. And so how did this woman end up with the most eligible bachelor on the planet? I mean, it doesn't seem like a natural progression. How did she do it? So that was really where I began, and where I'm, you know, beginning. How did it happen? Because it's such an unlikely trajectory for someone to come from that point to the point she ended up in. So so that's my story. That's where I'm going with it. It's how, and obviously, like most of these amazing stories where people are climbing up from a low base, it's to do with the connections that they make and the chance encounters and what they make of the situations they find themselves in. But in her case, it's so dramatic and interesting and funny. I think she was a very funny woman, and he was a very funny man. I mean, there was I'm reading lots of anecdotes and in fact, I'm going through all kinds of stuff, but my one of the best sources is Edward VIII's autobiography, which is called A King's Story. And in it, there's this brilliant anecdote which I've just been reading today actually, where he's about to tell his brothers that he's abdicating. and he's going to Windsor Castle to tell them, to say, I'm actually going, guys, you know, sorry. And he says, I arrived at the Frogmore Gate. Old so-and-so opens the gate for me. He had a leg shot off at Ypres, and he's got a wooden leg. But he stumps cheerfully towards me along the path. He opens the gate and waves cheerily before returning to his cottage, the full force of his body bearing down in his stump of a leg. And I think to myself, there's a happy man. He doesn't have my problems. It's just so brilliant. The absolute lack of self-awareness is off the scale. And you know what's not to love about an anecdote like that? It's just wow. So there you are. There's a lot like that.
Yeah,
that's what you have to look forward to.
Did he actually pen that? Was it ghosted, that book?
Well, I think he wrote quite a lot of it, and because she wrote one too brilliantly. I mean, this is like Crawford.
Got good source material.
Yeah, they all brilliantly and conveniently wrote their own autobiographies. So Crawford wrote The Little Princesses. Edward VIII wrote A King's Story. And Wallace wrote her own, well, she was helped with it. Hers was ghosted, but I can sort of hear her voice. Hers is called The Heart Has Its Reasons, which is quite cryptic. Yeah. But actually,
I think modern day members of the family might be being discouraged from writing things down.
Absolutely, I know, but I think they probably, I suppose that's quite a good example, because the kind of the distance between the man on the gate and Edward VIII was so profound, and yet he sort of saw it in a completely different way. I mean, it's that kind of extreme that sort of draws me to it. Really, it's quite amazing.
Did you find, as you're researching all these characters, are there any that you come to really like and others that you come to just think, oh, you know, that you dislike? Do you get quite attached to them when you get inside their heads?
Yeah, I do. I'm very attached to Wallace. She's my new favourite person, and I'm very attached to all her. I mean, the kind of brilliant thing about the 30s and the kind of sort of love lives of royalty. I mean, obviously, as you probably know, Edward VIII had a couple of mistresses before he ended up with Wallace, and they had these really fantastic names. One was called Frida, which is brilliant, and one was called Thelma. Can you imagine? They look like something, off the kind of Likely Lads or something, but they were these kind of dazzling high society figures, Thelma and Frida, and they were the kind of, you know, the people that went before. So it's that sort of, you know, you have a sort of 21st century perspective on these amazing figures, but they were very powerful and glamorous people. And Thelma was, yeah, it was through her really that Wallace met Edward VIII. So yeah, I mean, I'm very fond of, because all these stories, I suppose, that they're all stories about women, really. I mean, The Governess is all about women. All the women characters are amazing, and I go on to in the Wallace book to find even more amazing women, and of course the Queen Mother turns up in that story. Similarly, as this quite sort of tricky character who Wallace has to contend with, who doesn't like her. There's a rock that she has to stay around and has to deal with right to the end of her life. So there are certain, if you think of it as a soap opera, which or a serial, they're the same people crop up in it. So
I have to ask, what do you think of The Crown? Because so many of the characters that you're talking about are brought to life so vividly in The Crown.
I do like The Crown. I think it's a bit well. I mean, I know it's not sort of meaning to be sort of deep and sort of psychologically sort of resonant, but I think it is a little bit superficial sometimes. But yeah, I mean, I do like it. The one I did have a big problem with, and I can see I'm going to have problems with this down the line, is I really thought they were very unfair on Edward and Wallace, and when the Nazi episode, I don't think they really actually were Nazis, but of course they did make this slight mistake of going to Germany, but then so did so many people, but of course they were photographed, you know, with Hitler, so, and that really didn't help, and that's obviously never really gone away. But I thought that was a pretty unfair episode, really. And all the stuff about Lord Mountbatten, who's a kind of fabulous villain in the Wallace book, was quite amazing as well. Although I gather they didn't go to the extremes they could have done. So yeah, I mean, I love it because it's. I mean, what it has in common with what I do and with The Governess and with Wallace is it sees these people as a huge and slightly unlikely personalities that they were. I mean, they've always, as I said right at the beginning of our talk, they've always seemed to me like people from a novel, like people from a film.
Yeah.
They're obviously huge characters, and they completely deserve the setting of a film or of a book, because they're just so interesting. So yeah, I think it's great, and because it's seen the fictionographical, I suppose you could say, potential of them.
I mean, you mentioned that when there hadn't been a book about the Windsors, a fiction book, which you were astonished by, and yet we've had in recent years so many films about the House of Windsor. I think of, you know, the Queen and the play, the audience, and I mean, what is it about this family that makes for such dramatic interest?
They are so dramatic, aren't they? I mean, the most unbelievable things happen to them, and I think they make these spectacularly terrible choices when it comes to you know, wives, and when it comes to friends and husbands, and they just seem to do spectacularly sort of mad things and make the worst possible choices for various sort of crazy reasons. And so I think it's a sort of, and of course all their mistakes play out on a seismic scale, because oh god, it says my battery's running low. I hope I'm not going to fall off the edge of the of cyberspace here. Everything they do is so everybody sees it, so the stakes are so high, and so the drama is enormous. So yeah, I think it's that, and also they're very glamorous, and they live in this mysterious world. So you know, I think it's all for all those reasons, really.
I've got one quick question before your battery goes, and then Tim says, just going back to the book, do you think that the Queen's loss of contact with Crawford was the result of advice from her counsellors, or even more so maybe the Queen Mother? Sort of going back to your point.
I think it was the Queen Mother. I mean, I don't think they needed advising. I think they were just very, very, very cross about it. I think they saw it as a. I mean, she was treated as a traitor. I mean, even now, apparently, people talk about doing a Crawford within the royal family, meaning to, you know, commit an act of sort of, you know, heinous treachery. I mean, and this was a family that had Anthony Blunt as an art advisor. You know, I thought Crawford was a traitor. You know, it's absolutely amazing. So the sort of frames of reference and the scale was a little bit skewed, you could say. But yeah, I think it's because they just didn't want anybody else doing it, and obviously that wasn't but of course people are going to do it, and that's a contract that they have, isn't it? You know, they live these lives, but we do want to know about them. I mean, that's how it works.
Thank you so much. It's absolutely brilliant this evening.
Oh, thank you.
Right into the book, and that was, you know, really amazing, really amazing.
Oh, well, my pleasure. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you so much, and thank you, Roya. Thank you for asking me this question.
We'll have to talk more offline.
Definitely. Definitely.
Absolutely fascinating. So thank you, Roya, for having a lovely chat with Wendy and interviewing. That's brilliant. And Wendy, I wish you all the success with the book. You know, we've got signed copies at the Chorleywood bookshop, and you know, obviously this would make a brilliant Christmas present, wouldn't it? And it's coming fast, Christmas.
Definitely. The best Christmas present.
And look forward to hosting an event with you when with your next book. So
lovely.
Maybe it won't have to be on Zoom then.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's been an absolutely fascinating evening. So thank you, Roy, and thank you, Wendy, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye for now. Bye.
Bye.